Members will please take their seats. Second day of hearings. First, as always, I need to see whose members are on WebEx. If you would give me an indication who's out there.
We have Alexandra Blasia, Brandon Woodward, Debbie Beaver, Delaney Thumley, Jordan Mahallahan, Junan Ramos, Kenny Titus, Leah Zarda Carr, Liz Dunn, Matt Sterling, Mike Hauser, Michelle Segan.
Thank you. Did you get that, Connie? Good. First up, bill introductions from committee members. Any bill introductions from committee? Seeing none. Bill introductions from the audience. Again, does not appear to be any bill introductions from the audience. Bill introductions is closed. Does the committee want the reviser to go over the House bill again, or can we go straight to the opponents and neutrals? Without objection, and we're going straight into it. This is House Bill 2184. I have the opponents. I did the proponents yesterday. I do note that Connie indicated I now have written testimony from Delaney Thorin, Kansas Heritage Farms. Her testimony will be in your file. You will be able to access that. Opponents. First up, Eric Smith, a member of the committee. That's a good question. I'm going to have to limit everybody to 3 minutes. We have a number of opponents and neutrals. Thank you. Good morning to Federal and State Affairs. I think I say that every morning. To you?
Absolutely. I appreciate the opportunity to testify. I'm not going to read my testimony to you. You have a copy of it. First of all, I know that you all know that I'm a law enforcement officer and that I've dealt with this in a number of different ways. So your probably preconceived notion is that, of course, you're against it. You're a cop. The idea that I want to bring to you, if you haven't read my testimony, is that there are aspects that are impacted anytime we make a broad, comprehensive change to the way we do business. And one of the things that's going to be affected is going to be DUI laws. And I know this because I look at what happens across the United States to other states that have done exactly what we're attempting to do. If you don't want to pay attention, if you want to stick your head in the sand and say that it's not really a problem, that if every time somebody brings up the negative impacts of legalizing marijuana, you're going to say that everything that's negative is a lie or a falsity, then my testimony will have no effect on you. We have to go with data. We have to look at the facts. The facts are that it does increase the number of DUI accidents, the number of DUI fatalities in every state. It does increase the number of suicides among young people in every state. 77% increase in Colorado between 2010 and 2015 between the ages of 10 and 19. 77% is not something you can dawdle off to a misprint or they looked at the wrong numbers. That's an incredible number. You really have to intentionally ignore statistics and say that, for instance, the Rocky Mountain high-intensity drug trafficking area report of 2017 is completely full of lies. These guys do this every year. Why would you say that? Why would they do that? Why would it be that important to them? Look at Humboldt County in California. There are a number of things that we have to look at, and we have to understand this as common sense at some point. when we look at the number of states that have come up with this. I included at the bottom of my testimony reports that were nonpartisan, not influenced. Please take a look at that and look at the impact. The number one killer of people under the age of 21 are motor vehicle accidents. If for no other reason, take a look at that. Thank you.
Thank you, and we'll take questions a little later, Representative. Next up is Eric Voth, MD, Kansas Medical Society. Good morning, sir.
I've been before the committee many times. I think many of you may have been in diapers when I started doing this. I'm an expert in not only internal medicine, but pain and addiction medicine. I was in practice for 30 years. 10 of that, I was also a medical director of a chemical dependence unit. I spent the last 8 years as vice president of primary care for Stormont Vale and supervised about 150 physicians. I'm involved nationally and internationally on this subject. I'll be open to questions later, but I want to be very specific about the legislation. First of all, if this is passed, we're bypassing the FDA and the FDA safety processes, and that is fundamental and critical. And every state that has allowed medical marijuana has bypassed the FDA. Maybe people don't care, but we should care because that's how we get the safety standards, warnings, etc. On page 2, you must pare down that list of conditions allowed. There's no science behind the vast majority, in fact, all of them except pain, and I included the current state of the literature in my handouts on pain. It would be the only one that I think is even marginally supportable. We need to be requiring warnings. For instance, these distribution points need to say, will not be distributed to pregnant women, will not be distributed to individuals with psychiatric history such as depression, psychosis, etc. We want to be sure that individuals that would recommend it must follow the prescription drug monitoring programs here in Kansas. They're excellent, and they work for opiates, and that needs to be something that would be added. THC content is horrible. I don't know how that slipped by. It's allowing 35% THC in the weed and 70% in extracts, meaning this is a psychotic or actually hallucinogenic level. And I'll tell you that other states are working to bring that down to around 5 to 15%. Colorado, our neighbor that got way ahead of this, is struggling with all the psychosis and violence that they're seeing, and they're trying to bring it down to about 5 to 15% THC allowed. There must be documentation. Several of my colleagues that are pain experts say they'll get these folks that are on marijuana with no history documented, no idea what they're treating, and that needs to be a part of it. The taxation point really makes me frown. In Colorado, for instance, in the 2019 HIDA report, for every dollar of taxation that was brought in, $4.5 were spent on the consequences and impacts. And I would say, if we're really after taxation, go after the beer taxes that haven't been touched since 1977, or the tobacco taxes that haven't been touched since 1972. 5-cent increase of the beer tax would bring you $1.7 million. I'm open for questions. I have a lot of information on what marijuana does, its negative impacts, but it's not a medicine. It should not be allowed as a medicine, and you should continue to hold the line. Unlike many other states, we need to be proud of holding the line. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Moses. It's been a while, but it's good to see you, sir.
Thank you, sir.
Next up is Dina Hubbard, MD, American Academy of Pediatrics, Kansas chapter, on WebEx. Dr. Hubbard, are you there?
Yes, can you hear me?
Please, yes, we can, and go forward, please.
Yes, thank you for the opportunity to be here today. My name is Dina Hubbard. I am a neonatologist and pediatrician, and today I am before you on behalf of the Kansas chapter of the American Academy of Pediatrics. I am here today to oppose House Bill 2184 on behalf of children. There is a lack of accepted safety for the use of marijuana as a drug or the substance and its derivatives under medical supervision. We do know that marijuana and its derivatives of today are very different from that of previous years. And we know that it has a tremendous effect on the developing brain. So as has been mentioned, we do worry about the use of it by pregnant women and especially by adolescents. The adolescent brain is growing and developing up through the age of 25. And we are very concerned about how this legislation might lead to increased availability to our patients. Now, there are forms that have been approved by the FDA, most recently in 2018, for 2 rare forms of epilepsy that is included in my written testimony. But outside of that, we do not encourage the use of it. There's much more that needs to be done, and we are in favor of reclassifying medical marijuana as a Schedule II drug so that it can be studied appropriately. But again, we worry about the connections in the brain and how this could affect children. Also, there is no consistency in these products. There's no way to know what you're going to get from one time to another. And because this would be dispensed through these other dispensaries, this disrupts the medical home. Lastly, I will just say that we are very concerned about how this is packaged, and it makes it very concerning that it could be available to children. Often it looks like gummies or things that are attractive to children, so it needs to be packaged appropriately as a medication, just like you would any medication safety-wise to prevent unintentional ingestion. Also, no drug should ever be administered through smoking. We know that smoking, as well as tobacco, marijuana has a well-documented negative effect on lung function, and
Dr.
children
30
should be
seconds left.
protected from second and third hand marijuana smoke. I know there's much concern about the opioid crisis, and I will just mention that there is research associating opioids and marijuana together having an even more deleterious effect. Thank you so much.
Thank you, ma'am. You'll be on WebEx for questions, is that correct?
I have to step away for rounds, but if our lobbyists can let me know, I will be happy to join back.
All right, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Next up is Robert Jacobs, Kansas Bureau of Investigation. Good morning, sir, and welcome to Fed and State Affairs.
This is on? Okay. Good morning, Chairman Barker and members of the committee. My name is Robert Jacobs. I am the Executive Officer at the Kansas Bureau of Investigation. Thank you for the opportunity to present testimony on House Bill 2184 in opposition of medical marijuana. The KBI is concerned about the impact that medical marijuana will have on public safety in Kansas. There are 3 main areas of focus that are in my written testimony that I think I would draw your attention to, but I wanted to discuss just 2 or 3 other issues on top of that. Primarily, the increased access to marijuana in Kansas that will come from medical marijuana. Currently, you heard yesterday that marijuana and other drugs are flowing into the state. Other conferees have confirmed this. Plus, in addition to that, our law enforcement is seizing drugs every day. Last year in 2020 alone, we had over 18,000 drug seizures in Kansas. And of those 18,000, over 10,000 of it was marijuana. Additionally, we see a black market that is coming up and will continue to thrive under medical marijuana. This is black market of illegal marijuana and other drugs as well. But we fear that the medical marijuana will enhance that black market, and we've seen that in other states as well. The other concerning thing about additional marijuana is that we fear with House Bill 2184 allowing for vegetative form of medical marijuana, we will see an additional rise in people extracting and trying to do an unauthorized extraction of THC. This is done for several reasons, but primarily to enhance the THC potency. The problem with doing this is this process is difficult. It involves solvents and flammable material, specifically butane, and it creates a hazardous waste when it's done, and that will be within Kansas. All of that is a concern to public safety. Additionally, we think that, unfortunately, Kansas law enforcement has continuously seen a direct connection to violent crime and drugs. As Representative Smith mentioned, in Colorado, when you look back at when they just had medicinal marijuana, it actually raised the impaired driving level 64%. Finally, I just want to address the issue of access to the people who are registered. Law enforcement will need to have access to that to confirm those people are registered. They will do that through, we'll need to do an interface between KDH&E and ks.gov to allow that. I know I'm running out of time, so I will just thank you again. I'll be available for questions, and I appreciate the opportunity to testify.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Next up is Chief Daryl Attenberry, Kansas Association of Chiefs of Police. Good morning, sir, and welcome to Federal and State Affairs.
I'm Daryl Attenberry with the Kansas Association of Chiefs of Police, and the KACP is in opposition to this bill. One of the reasons is the effect on some of the facets of law enforcement, one of which is police dogs. For smaller agencies in the state of Kansas that have an association, the Kansas Police Dog Association, there are 41 dogs. Now this doesn't take into account Kansas Highway Patrol, the Wichita PD, Salina, Lawrence. They're larger agencies. This is the largest agencies in this group are Hutch and Andover. I checked with Chief Mike Keller with Andover, and he told me that it costs about $20,000 to obtain, train the dog and the handler, and for the necessary equipment for each dog. If this passes, those dogs won't be available because they detect marijuana. They won't be able to be used in the way they've been used now. They'll have to be replaced, and that cost is around $820,000 spread across those 41 agencies. That's big. Now I'd move on to the bill itself. We've seen some problems with the wording. There's some vagueness. There's some contradictory elements of the bill. One is that, and it was mentioned, that we don't have a way to verify that somebody's medical marijuana card is valid. There's not a registry listed in the bill, and for our officers who work 24 hours a day, they need access to that. We see counterfeit driver's licenses now. We know we'll see counterfeit medical marijuana cards. Another is a caregiver issue, and that's this is all listed in my written testimony. In Section 11, it has to do makes reference to the 90-day supply and the caregiver, et cetera. But there's an issue with that, and that is that what happens if the patient dies? What happens to that marijuana processed product that they've obtained? What happens to that supply? What's the process to return or destroy that leftover product? Whatever type it is. The other thing I'd like to mention is the list of maladies that can be addressed with medical marijuana. The Parkinson's disease, this is from their website, that's their position paper, says there's no real effect on Parkinson's disease. This is from the Veterans Administration. They say repeatedly that there is no evidence that marijuana is effective for PTSD, and in fact, it can be harmful to individuals with PTSD. The same for glaucoma. There are things on this list that should not be on this list for the good of the patients. Thank you very much, and I'll stand for questions later.
Chief, I have, just before I forget this, so what is the process now if a patient dies if they're receiving opioids or other controlled substances? Do we have a process in plan for that?
No, we don't.
Okay, thank you.
But we do have drug collections through the DEA
Right.
that we put on each year, and like at my department, we actually have a disposal facility.
So this may also work for that.
It could.
All right, thank you. Next up is Cole Presley, Sheriff in Graham County, Kansas Sheriff's Association. Good morning. Welcome to Federal and State Affairs, Sheriff.
Good morning. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to stick this morning to something that's specific to Kansas sheriffs, and that's jails. We're different than other law enforcement agencies in that it's our responsibility to house those who've been arrested either pre or post-trial. Calling medical marijuana medicine will put us in a position to develop policies that prohibit us administering this to inmates, which puts us in a position to eventually answer in court why we're denying that medication and why we believe it's a safety issue in the jail. So essentially, we're placed in a position where previously we may have arrested this person for possessing this. Now they have a medical card for one of the given reasons that's there, and now that they're incarcerated for any other crime, we're required to let them consume it while they're in the jail facility. Folks, if you have one inmate who comes in with a medical card and we're required to let them use medical marijuana, every inmate will develop a condition that requires us to administer medical marijuana as well. Because they're in our care, that means I'm the one that's buying that at the same time, and there's a whole host of issues, I believe, that come to sheriffs with that. The second thing outside of my written testimony that I'd like to bring up is this. Almost every state that we've seen go down this path, this is just one step closer to legalizing recreational marijuana. It's just one more step, and this doesn't appear to be any different than most of those other models that we've seen. The closer we get to it, the greater we become concerned. I appreciate the opportunity to testify, and I'll be happy to answer any questions later.
Thank you, Sheriff. I'm going to butcher this last name. Paul Skidlitsky? Probably not. I'm going to let you announce your own. I'm not good at that.
Mr. Chairman, good morning. It's Schlifke, or common spelling is IT's people.
Thank you. Very good. Good morning, sir, and welcome to Federal and State Affairs.
Good morning, Chairman, members. Thank you for the opportunity to testify. My name is Paul Schlifke. I'm the immediate past president of the Kansas Peace Officers Association. I'm also Deputy Chief of Police at Wamego, and the KPOA respectively opposes House Bill 2184. Your time is valuable, so I'm limiting my oral testimony to 3 points. First of all, the KPOA notes that marijuana remains illegal under federal law. It's classified as a Schedule I drug, and in states with medical marijuana laws, it places federal agencies such as the Drug Enforcement Administration in conflict with state and local agencies. I respectfully remind the committee of a case several years ago where Kansas citizens elected to follow state law concerning silencers for firearms instead of federal law, and they were successfully prosecuted and the federal convictions were appealed. Regarding edibles, the KPOA acknowledges ingesting marijuana in the form of edibles does not expose others to secondhand smoke. However, edibles are not prescription pills or prescription capsules. They have not gone through the FDA testing and screening for safety and specific dosage or THC content. Once removed from packaging, edibles have the same appearance as other food that does not contain marijuana. In line with the THC content quality assurance, the clause in House Bill 2184 regarding a 90-day supply is determined, so therefore it is affected. And I note here Kansas does not have any field tests for law enforcement officers that produce a percent readout of THC result. Our field tests either say THC is present or it's not present. My third and final comment regards security of cultivation and processing and distribution. There is nothing in HB 2184 regulating the physical security of locations where the marijuana will be grown, how it will be transported, or the processing of distribution. I anticipate, and I think it would be a fair assumption, that even if high security measures are in place, someone is going to try and figure out a way to steal the product. And this presents a danger not only to the people working there, but also to law enforcement responding to calls. And in summary, it continues to be the position of the KPOA that any drug treating a person, including marijuana, should go through the same process, including FDA approval to control content and dosage, should be subscribed by a medical professional, should be dispensed at a pharmacy as are other controlled substances. Thank you for your time, and I'll stand for questions later.
Thank you very much. Committee, I have two written opponents, Victor Riggins, Kansas Narcotic Officers Association, and Melissa Ragsdale. Those are all the opponents that I have. Are there others in the audience? Seeing none. Committee questions for the opponents? Yes, Representative Heiberger, if you'll identify who or ask a general question and see who.
I have a question for Representative Smith.
Yes, go right ahead.
Yeah, just regarding your youth suicide data from Colorado, is there anything in that research that correlates the increase in the suicide rate specifically to marijuana legalization? I know we've had a large increase in suicide rate among youth here and all across the country in the last decade.
Mr. Chairman, thank you for that question. Actually, I need to clarify what I said there. I said that there was a 77.5% increase in suicides. Actually, that number is 77.5% increase of marijuana present in those who committed suicide. The difference, and this comes from the Western Journal of Emergency Medicine, that between 2004 and 2009, there were a little over 4,800 suicides. The next 5 years, up to 2015, there were over 5,800, almost 5,900 suicides. Of those, 12.6% tested positive for THC. In the previous 5 years, it was about 7%. So that's an increase of 77.5%.
Thank you. Further questions of committee? Yes, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Jacobs.
I apologize for being late.
That's all right.
If I may,
Please.
this question may be for the reviser,
Okay.
and maybe the committee has already hit upon it. On line or page 8 of the bill, and on line 28 and 43, it talks about.
Could I have you speak into the mic so the reviser can hear you?
Yes, sir. It talks about a 90-day supply of medical marijuana. What is a 90-day supply of medical marijuana? What does that look like? How many pounds or ounces or kilos or whatever it is?
You're referring that to the reviser?
Correct. Yes, sir. Thank you.
Thank you. Matt, are you on?
Yes, Mr. Chairman. So, and thank you for the question. If you look at sections 14 and 15, they require the Secretary of KDH&E to adopt rules and regulations for the Act. And one of those rules and regulations that's required of the department is to establish the maximum 90-day supply of medical marijuana that could be possessed. So that would be established by rules and regulations adopted by the Secretary of KDH&E.
Go ahead.
So within this bill, it really doesn't specify it'll go to rules and regs, and they'll be able to decide if it's a joint or a pound of marijuana. Is that what I'm hearing?
Well, the bill does create a committee run by Health and Environment, and they would decide many of those issues because that's where the doctors are at. Would that be not correct, Matt?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So there is that committee that advises as well. Section 33 of the bill also prescribes the forms of which medical marijuana can exist. It prohibits anything that includes the smoking, combustion, or vaporization. So there would be no exception for that under rules and regulations. But in terms of the quantity of medical marijuana that constitutes a 90-day supply, that would be determined by rules and regulations.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Chair has a question for Sheriff Presley. Sheriff, you know, and I understand your responsibilities are not just law enforcement, but corrections, because you do house the prisoners, and you're the one that's ultimately responsible for the health and the welfare of the prisoners that's in your care. If this should come about, all of our surrounding states have either recreational marijuana or medical marijuana. So those sheriffs in those counties have probably got some policies in place. So if this should happen, would you not just contact those sheriffs and see how they're handling, or would you set up your own policies and procedures?
A great majority of us already have a no narcotics policy within the jail. Those are typically tested within the courts. So as far as prohibiting this from being given in the jail, it's a matter of simply changing our policy. But we will be tested and tested on a regular basis in court once we change that policy. We'll be in habeas hearings a lot.
I mean, we've got over 30 states that have some type of medical marijuana or open marijuana, for lack of a better term. So those sheriff's departments and law enforcement are able to adapt, or have been able to adapt.
That's not a question we've asked. Primarily, our focus in anticipating a future change has been on how we mitigate the increase in property crimes and the impact on the community, not necessarily the jails, other than an anticipated increased population.
Okay, well, you raised that issue, and I know the sheriffs are unique to that, having both law enforcement and corrections responsibilities.
Yes, sir.
Okay, thank you. Representative Epley.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I would ask Dr. Vogt just to pop back up here, if you would, please.
Sir?
Thank you, Eric. I really appreciate your background in this field and all the knowledge you bring to testimony, and I listened carefully, and I appreciate all your emails over the years on trying to educate me from your perspective, and that's very good. I guess what I want to get into is the designation by the DEA of marijuana and its ongoing pushback, and yet we have, I think, now 40 plus states that have some form of legal or medical marijuana, and that has never been litigated by the FDA or by any official federal agency towards those states. Do you have any insider knowledge why that hasn't occurred? Because it's very troubling when you're looking at this subject objectively.
Yeah, it's really puzzling, because if you look at what they did, for instance, with tobacco, FDA stepped up and said nicotine is a medicine and cigarettes are a delivery form of that medicine, ergo we, FDA, will control that whole process. Oddly enough, the whole marijuana industry has said, oh yeah, we've got a medicine, but we're going to control it all ourselves, and the FDA has never stepped up. I will tell you that there's a group of us working on probably suing the FDA for both jeopardizing the public and a failure to fulfill their responsibilities for public safety in terms of saying absolutely medical marijuana is our purview, and we are taking this over. The typical safety things that the FDA expects and that we as physicians would expect just evaporate with medical marijuana, and such as what strength the person is using. There's very clear evidence now that a lot of these psychic episodes, psychosis, depression, violent episodes, etc., are with the very high percentage marijuanas. That's why a number of states are starting to look at, well, can we back this down to maybe 5 to 15%, because they haven't seen as much violence. That's coming internationally as well. So there's a lot the FDA could do to kind of settle this issue. and I hope they do it. It's been interesting also to see way back, like to the Nixon era, FDA will step up and try to get a little control, and then there will be a much more tolerant administration that comes in, and then another less tolerant, and so there's this kind of wave back and forth, and it is completely up in the air at this point.
Eric, not to be too rhetorical, but I would just comment that this has evolved over 40 plus years, maybe 50 years, and there's been some very minimal pushback on the Schedule I issue with all these states, but nothing definitive, and it's very troubling when we're looking at policy as our constituents look at this, and we do look at it a little different. I guess then I would call back to the mic, and I'm going to mess up his name too, Mr. Chairman. Paul, Mr. Skidliski, Schnischke, is he available to?
He is.
Come back up. Thank you,
Sure.
Dr. Voth. Thank you, sir, and thank you for your testimony, and thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just wanted to clarify, you had touched on this, and I wanted to make sure I had a clear understanding. I didn't see anything in this bill regarding cultivation, and I wanted to make sure that you and I had a clear understanding on this bill that there is nothing in here about growing marijuana or transporting it through the state of Kansas as far as cultivating it within the state boundaries. Were you did you understand that was the case, that we would be growing marijuana, sir?
I didn't want to interpret anything that wasn't there, but I did not see anything regulating where the marijuana would be cultivated.
So I just want to be clear that there's nothing in here about cultivation in this bill, and that we had a clear understanding that we're not, through this bill, wanting to see marijuana grown within the state of Kansas. So I didn't know if that testimony really had validity in that situation.
Well, even if it's grown elsewhere, it still has to be transported, and I believe as popular as marijuana is recreationally, which has nothing to do with this bill, and I respect that, I still think that there's security issues with the transportation and also where they will be, where the marijuana will be distributed or sold at.
Certainly. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Representative Hoyt.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I know that Dr. Hubbard had to hop off for rounds. I did want to address one of her questions about the packaging and child safety. So I was wondering if the revisor could walk us through on page 19, line 32, on the poison prevention packaging standards. Is this going to look the same as another prescription? Could you just give us a vision of what those requirements are, please?
Matt?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So if you look in section 28 that Representative Hoy is referring to, so there's a requirement for it's section 29, I misspoke, for a processor licensee. When processing medical marijuana, they're required to package the medical marijuana in accordance with child-resistant effectiveness standards. So that's a requirement put on the processor, who then would distribute medical marijuana to those retail dispensaries.
So that's how it would arrive at the dispensary. What would does it have any requirements for how it is distributed to the patient or the consumer?
Thank you again. So, Mr. Chairman, for a retail dispensary, if the committee looks in section 32 on page 22, the requirements for a dispensary are that they on the dispensed medical marijuana, that they label the packaging with the name and address of the processor that produced and produced the product, the name of the patient and caregiver, the name of the physician who recommended the treatment, the directions for use, a health warning is specified in rules and regs adopted by the Secretary of KDH&E, the date on which the medical marijuana was dispensed, and the quantity, strength, kind, or form of medical marijuana that was contained in the package.
Thank you, Matt. Moving right along, last question before we go to the neutrals, Representative Jacobs.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, again. And if I may address this maybe to whoever would like to answer this in the law officer field. It's been told to me, we've had conversations that when individuals consume or smoke marijuana, it pacifies them. They're all calm, they're all good. And they're just peace-loving individuals, I guess. With this particular bill, if this bill became law, would we actually see that come to fruition, that people would be sedated and that crime would lower and all these mental issues would magically disappear? Or would this be more of a hindrance and a safety issue upon them and their job?
I'll just let any of the law enforcement officers, Ed, would you, okay, come up, Chief.
Well, I would agree that some people experience passivity, calmness with marijuana. I've seen through my 39 years of policing that is the case. But more recently, in the last few years, we're seeing more marijuana-induced psychosis with people becoming violent after the use of high THC marijuana. So where it used to be the case with 7%, THC, when you get up into the 30s and 40% THC, it has a different effect. It's a new drug. It's not the old marijuana. It's something new, and it has a negative effect on their behavior.
Thank you, Chief. Thank you. Yes, go ahead.
If I may, then in this particular bill, or with this process that we're debating and hearing, how would we assure that these new genetically modified marijuana strands would not have that high THC, and that we could actually protect the public with this particular drugs coming on the streets?
I'm going to direct that to Matt, the reviser.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Matt, we've lost your voice. Did you mute yourself?
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. If I could defer that question for just a moment so I can look up the testing requirements that are in the bill, I'd be happy to give that answer to the committee very shortly.
That will be perfect. While we're waiting for that, we're going to move to the neutrals. First up would be Eric Stafford, Kansas Chamber of Commerce. Same conditions, 3 minutes. Good morning and welcome to Federal and State Affairs.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and committee members. Good morning. My name is Eric Stafford, Vice President of Government Affairs for the Kansas Chamber, and we appreciate the opportunity today to testify neutral on House Bill 2184. Since we only have 3 minutes, I'll focus on page 46, where the language starts regarding workers' compensation and unemployment insurance benefits, and allowing for compensation for injured parties if they have a medical marijuana or if they're considered a patient under this act and suffer an injury on the job. We've attached some model language that's probably going to have to be tweaked a little bit specific to Kansas. This was in our network from our Council of State Chambers for states to utilize that as they grapple with medical marijuana or recreational marijuana laws. And this language that's attached is just essentially protections for employers, just stating that the employer policy will still rule over the state's marijuana laws. So, we have, whether it's manufacturing or construction, higher risk type of professions that there might be a slightly higher exposure for injury compared to a more retail lower risk setting. Ultimately, those decisions are best left to employers, and we would encourage and respectfully ask that the committee adopt language that would protect the employer policy not go the route that this bill does, which would open up and allow for compensation for individuals who test positive for marijuana. So that's the summary of our testimony. As I mentioned, that language is on the second page. I think it's second and third page of our testimony, but happy to answer any questions at the appropriate time.
Thank you. Next up is John Goodyear, League of Kansas Municipalities. Good morning, John, and welcome to Federal State Affairs again.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman. Glad to be back. Members of the committee, good morning. Thank you again for affording me the opportunity to come before you today and give testimony on behalf of the League and our member cities. Because we represent most of the cities in the state of Kansas, we come in neutral because, as you can imagine, they have differing stances on what this legislation should look like or whether it's even needed. We have cities on one side of the spectrum which would prefer that medical marijuana be allowed in increased circumstances. We have cities on the other side of the spectrum which would prefer the absolute prohibition remain enshrined in our state law. And then the vast majority of our cities fall somewhere in between. So as I was prepping for it was actually the 2019 interim committee on medical marijuana, I went to our policy committee, which is made up of elected officials and city employees all throughout the state, and said, I need some kind of statement. I need some kind of guiding principle. What do you need to see in legislation if it comes? And I've included the policy statement that they came up with and that was approved by our league governing body in my testimony. I'm not going to read it for you verbatim. So just as a summary, don't support, don't oppose, but this is what our member cities said that they would need to see if legislation came. So working from that statement and looking at House Bill 2184, there are sections of this bill that our member cities would be in favor of. For example, they support provisions that will require cultivators to comply with local zoning in order to obtain a license. Additionally, they support the provision that clearly prohibits driving under the influence of medical marijuana. Perhaps a penalty clause should be included there, but they're supportive of that provision. And they support provisions that prohibit cultivation by those not holding licenses issued by the state, effectively prohibiting home grow operations, which is something we heard from our member cities is a deal breaker. They don't want to see home grow in Kansas. That said, there are also some key components that our members feel are still missing from this legislation. They strongly believe that cities should have the ability to opt in, that they should take an affirmative vote on whether or not to include dispensaries in their city, and that they should otherwise be able to restrict the location of retailers through legitimate zoning regulations. Additionally, training for law enforcement and human resource professionals is going to be needed to allow for implementation of this law, and the League would ask that as the committee consider this bill, you consider apportioning some revenue from fines, fees, and taxes to local governments to help fund this training, and that the committee also consider moving the effective date of the legislation back to allow time to develop policies and procedures and ordinances to implement this act and to do it right. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I will stand for questions at the appropriate time. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Tucker Poling, Kansas Board of Healing Arts. Tucker, I'd normally see you at Health and Human Services. Welcome to Fed and State Affairs.
Thank you, Thank you, Mr. Chair. Members of the committee, my name is Tucker Poling. I'm the Executive Director of the Kansas State Board of Healing Arts. The board licenses and regulates over 32,000 healthcare providers in this state from 15 different healthcare professions. I'm here today to provide neutral testimony because a significant administrative issue with this bill is that this bill requires the Board of Healing Arts to do some very important things if you move forward with this, including issuing the medical certificates, determining the qualifications for the certificates, making sure that physicians are following the rules laid out in the bill about prescribing marijuana, reviewing and evaluating the annual reports from clinicians regarding the effectiveness in their practice of medical marijuana, evaluating and approving continuing education, determining the grounds for revoking a certificate, investigating and litigating any complaints relating to failure to comply with the certificate requirements, and the rules, and this is important, the rules for the minimum standard of care when treating with medical marijuana. If you were to move forward with this bill, that's a process that we would take very seriously. It would be very important but it will take resources. And right now in the bill, there is no mechanism to fund this. We are a fee-funded agency, completely fee-funded. The other agencies involved in this bill, those sections include provisions where they can charge a fee for the license or certificate or whatever they're doing. That is absent in new section 17. So if the legislature does move forward with that, we feel it would be very important to include in new section 17 a provision whereby we could charge a fee for those who are seeking the certificate to prescribe medical marijuana. I know you are very pressed for time today, Mr. Chair, but I will stand for questions at the appropriate time.
Thank you. I would ask you to maybe propose some language, because you're exactly right, and we found that to be wanting in the bill. We didn't know, just subjectively pulling a number out of a hat.
Sure.
So if you could supply that to us, we would appreciate it.
Be happy to do that, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Next up, Alexandria Blasi, State Board of Pharmacy. Are you by WebEx? I'm sorry.
Yes, I am. Can you hear me okay?
We can hear you. Please go forward.
Wonderful. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm Alexandra Blasi. I'm the Executive Director of the Kansas State Board of Pharmacy. The board wishes to testify as neutral on House Bill 2184 today and appreciates the opportunity to do so. Would like to note, of course, that the board does not take a position on the legalization of medical marijuana, but instead is trying to provide some information if the legislature decides to move forward. If they do, the board strongly does support inclusion of medical marijuana into the Kansas Prescription Drug Monitoring Program, as well as the requirement for physicians to review this information. The board is actually the agency tasked with maintaining the prescription monitoring program. We call it K-Track, so that's going to be how I refer to it. But we have some questions. For example, the bill requires that the physician or the physician's designee request the K-Trax report. The board wonders who these designees are, how they would gain access to K-Trax, and what restrictions would surround their access or further dissemination of reports. In addition, we have some questions about where, if at all, reports would be stored. And the board in general suggests limiting access to physicians and designees authorized under the Prescription Monitoring Program Act, as well as limiting further dissemination of or storage in accordance with the Kansas Prescription Monitoring Program Act. The bill also requires retail dispensaries report to the K-Trax program the information. Though the board strongly supports this reporting, there are a few functional issues. First, there's no articulation of the degree of frequency with which the retail dispensaries are required to report. K-Trax usually requires daily reporting of controlled substance information, so we would recommend that similar timeline. And this prevents the shopping of the patients that could potentially happen from this. And then we also have a question because retail dispensaries do not actually have access to the K-Trax system to create accounts. That's done by the Board of Pharmacy, and the Board of Pharmacy is not mentioned anywhere in this bill. So we have some questions about just functionally how that would happen and what the responsibilities of the board would be in that regard. Of course, we are also the only agency tasked with or vested with the authority to review compliance for submission of information. And so we wonder how other agencies would manage that enforcement authority because they would not have access. And then I will also just point out that K-Trax information is highly sensitive. There would be no way to segregate medical marijuana from the controlled substance prescriptions. So that's something to take into account. Other pharmacists and other users of K-Trax would have access to all this information. Most importantly, I think I need to point out two things. One, there's no fee or revenue to the Board of Pharmacy for changing the parameters of this program, which there would certainly be costs associated with that. And then second, the board does believe that based on other state models, pharmacists should be involved at some point in the retail dispensing process, if for no other reason to provide consulting services, but most importantly to prevent drug interactions, which is a very, very dangerous potential issue with regard to patients. While physicians may do some of that, pharmacists really are tasked.
Your time has expired.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
I would ask one question before I leave you. I'm going to ask that you work with one of our committee members, Dr. Epley. I'm not familiar with the I am familiar with the K-track, but I know you're more familiar with it. You worked with him on some proposed language. And is it 13 or 18 states where pharmacists are involved in medical marijuana?
I actually don't know for sure. I was able to identify 7 specific states that do involve pharmacists, but I don't have all of the information from a full 50-state survey yet.
All right, thank you very much. Next up is Debbie Beavers, Alcoholic Beverage Control Division, the Director on WebEx. Debbie, are you there?
I am.
Please go forward.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. My name is Debbie Beavers, and I'm the Director of Alcoholic Beverage Control. Thank you for the opportunity to testify. We are neutral, and you should have my written testimony. Under this bill, ABC would license and regulate processors, distributors, dispensaries, and employees similarly to how we regulate the liquor industry today. I'm doing my best to keep this brief for you, but we do have a few concerns that I would like to point out for your consideration. First, the bill requires 15% of processor, distributor, and dispensary license to be issued to economically disadvantaged groups as specified in the bill, who are also U.S. citizens and residents of the state of Kansas. ABC would recommend removing that Kansas residency requirement be removed due to that recent U.S. Supreme Court decision regarding residency and liquor licenses. Also, processor, distributor, and dispensary licenses would have a limit on the number of licenses available. The bill requires the number to be set by the ABC director and rules and regulations and consider the population of Kansas and the number of patients seeking treatment for dispensaries. And then for dispensaries, we also need to consider the geographic location. ABC has spoken with other states that do have caps on licenses, and they do have a high number of lawsuits appealing denial of their license application. So that is something we would ask consideration for moving forward. We would also ask for some clarification on the ability for a processor to sell both to a distributor and directly to the dispensary. In alcohol regulation, we use a 3-tier system that separates the manufacturer from selling directly to the retailer. Also, as previously mentioned, transportation of marijuana is not addressed in the bill anywhere. Employees, ABC does recommend that all employees be licensed and that a minimum employee age be established. License fee maximums are set in the bill, but the bill requires the ABC director to set the actual fees and rules and regulations, and we would respectfully request that the legislature set those license fees in statute.
30 seconds left.
So there's plant materials referred to in section 33, and we would ask for a definition of that to be added. And then finally, rules and regulations must be adopted on or before July 1 of 2022, and this deadline would be really difficult to meet. Those are our comments. We appreciate the opportunity to provide them, and I'll be happy to stand for questions at the appropriate time. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Last up is Kay Haug with the Kansas Department of Health and Environment. Kay, are you on WebEx?
I am. Can you hear me?
Please, we hear you. Go forward.
Okay, thank you. Chairman Barker and members of the committee, I am Kay Haug, State Registrar for Vital Statistics and Director of the Bureau of Epidemiology and Public Health Informatics for the Kansas Department of Health and Environment, KDHE. Thank you for the opportunity to provide neutral testimony for House Bill 2184. 2184 authorizes the creation of the Kansas Medical Marijuana Regulation Act, providing for the establishment of a cannabis program for registered patients with qualifying medical conditions as diagnosed by a licensed physician. KDG would establish a process to certify eligibility for an applicant to receive medical marijuana products. Patients and, when necessary, caregivers will be issued an identification card, which will allow the individual to acquire cannabis products as directed by the licensed physician. KDHE would implement and maintain a secure real-time information system to house data and exchange information statewide on a 24/7, 365 basis with our 4 program agencies being Revenue, Agriculture, Board of Healing Arts, and KDG, and with law enforcement. To support the Kansas Medical Marijuana Regulation Act, KDG would establish a new agency bureau, onboarding of a director and corresponding staff, along with the development of an IT solution, which includes identifying system specifications, submitting a request for purchase, conducting thorough testing of this new system, and ensuring integration with these partner agencies and law enforcement are amongst our duties. Regulations will also need written. The bill states on or before July 1 of 2022, the program will be in place. This timeline does not provide ample time for KDHE to complete our task. A go-live date of July 1 of 2023 is recommended. Thank you for the opportunity to provide this testimony, and I am available for questions.
Thank you. At this time, committee, there will be questions for the neutrals. Questions from the committee.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes.
Did you want me to jump in on that answer that you were waiting for? I'm sorry.
Yes, that's a good, thank you for bringing it to my attention. This is Representative Jacobs' question.
Yes, thank you again, Mr. Chairman. So if the committee looks at section 27 of the bill, it requires the Secretary of Agriculture to adopt rules and regulations for the testing that's to be performed of laboratories when laboratories are performing testing of medical marijuana. That is going to be funded by, in section 26, the Medical Marijuana Cultivation Regulation Fund, which collects fees from licensed laboratories and cultivators. And then laboratories, when they are testing medical marijuana, would be required to test for the potency, homogeneity, and contamination, or any potential contamination in the medical marijuana.
Thank you. Helpful, Representative Jacobs and Representative Hoyt.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like some clarification on cultivator, the definition on the first page of the bill, and then when it talks about the cultivator license on page 16. My understanding of this bill was that people could get a license to cultivate and grow in Kansas.
Matt?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yes, that's correct. Licensed cultivators that were given a license by the Secretary of Agriculture under the act would be allowed to grow, subject to restrictions. Let me pull up their exact ones. Like they can't be within 1,000 feet of schools, libraries, public parks, etc. And then the distinction between that level 1 and level 2 cultivator license was the amount of square footage the cultivator would be allowed to have to grow medical marijuana. And that distinction was 25,000 square feet for a level 1 and 3,000 square feet for a level 2. And then the Secretary of Agriculture would also be required to determine the number of those licenses to issue based off of the population of Kansas and the number of individuals seeking medical marijuana in Kansas.
Representative Jacobs.
Thank you, Madam Vice Chair. Matt, if you could you point out to the committee or to myself, where in this bill is there employer protections? I know that in some jobs, though the drugs are legal or over-the-counter drugs are legal, particular jobs don't want people using Sudafed or whatever. They want their employees to be sober-minded and vigilant. Is there any protections in this if an individual has a medical marijuana card and is prescribed marijuana? Is there protections for the employee to make disciplinary action against that individual?
Thank you. If you look at, let me pull it up. So if you look at section 64,
It amends KSA 44-1009 concerning unlawful employment practices. And it would make it unlawful for an employer to refuse to hire or to fire a person or to discriminate against that person in terms of compensation or terms of employment based on the fact of that person's possession or use of medical marijuana. And then, let me see. So that's a partial answer. I'm looking for the rest of it.
We can come back, Matt. Thank you. Do you have a follow-up?
No, thank you, Madam Chair.
Representative Carpenter.
Thank you, Madam Vice Chair. We're still in the neutral section, correct?
Correct.
Okay, thank you. My question is to Mr. Stafford from the Kansas Chamber. Thank you, Mr. Stafford.
Sure, good morning.
So I have not had a chance to pull up your written testimony, so if you hit on this, I apologize. The business community here in the state of Kansas, are they asking for this to have the opportunity to potentially have a business and growing and just trying to distribute medical marijuana?
No, we haven't heard from anybody from that aspect. The only feedback we've gotten is just if this is going to happen, ensure that our policies, if we have a drug-free work environment, that is still allowed. That's all we've heard so far.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Epley, I had you listed. Okay, good.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Go ahead. Oh, I'm sorry.
Yes, go right ahead. Go. No, go ahead.
I'm sorry again. I was just going to give the rest of that answer that I failed to have before. Under the labor employment law, it would nothing in that section that would prohibit that discrimination against somebody based off of their use of medical marijuana would be construed to prohibit a person from taking action necessary to procure or maintain benefits under the law, and then the registration or any rules, regulations adopted under that.
Thank you. Was that helpful, Representative? Good. Representative Smith, now.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And this is for Matt. And it's referenced the laboratories doing the testing, et cetera. I was able to find that in the bill, and frankly, it's a very comprehensive bill, and I may have overlooked it at some point or drifted away. But is there anything in the bill that proposes funding or the mechanism by which an enforcement agency or even a law enforcement officer would determine that a product found in a package dispensed is actually the product that was originally dispensed in that package and not replaced? Also, how would a law enforcement officer determine that the concentration of the product in that package is conforming to the statute and not exceeding?
My initial thought is that I can't recall specific provisions pertaining for a law enforcement officer. The testing requirements and pertain to the Secretary of Agriculture and establishing those. Let me review the bill and try to see if I can find any additional information for you, Representative.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Matt.
Thank you. Representative Wagner.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think these questions would go to Matt. The League of Kansas Municipalities brought up that there is no local option in this bill, that where counties would have the ability to opt out. Is that correct? I mean, this is a statewide, as currently written. What can you tell us about that?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So there is not a provision for a county to opt out or opt in. a cultivator license or a dispensary license is issued by either the secretary for the cultivator license or the director of ABC for the dispensary. There is that limit on the number of them, and there's the location in terms of they can't be located near certain places. Yes, there's not an option to opt out of it.
Okay. A follow-up question.
You may.
The lady from the Alcoholic Beverage Control Division mentioned that any notion of residency requirements where this would limit, people dispensing, selling, whatever, to be Kansas residents is not constitutional, as we had in a bill earlier discussed. But that would be correct. You really can't limit licenses to just Kansas residents for any of the operations of medical marijuana in Kansas.
So is that, I haven't evaluated that question. I would imagine, I don't want to speculate on the director's behalf, but it would be consistent with that request, or what was the change that was made in proposed in House Bill 2212 in terms of just eliminating the residency requirements. But I don't know if I am prepared to speculate on the constitutionality of it.
That bill was based on a Supreme Court decision, but thank you for your input.
Right. For alcohol though, that was I'm just not prepared on medical marijuana.
Thank you. Then I'm going to direct you to the written neutrals that are shown in your today's agenda. With that, I'm going to close the hearing on House Bill 2184. I'm going to talk about tomorrow. Tomorrow we have a couple of bills to hear. We may be working a bill, and we may be working the surveillance bill, which has to do with Representative Corbett's bill, if you recall that. We may try to work the bills that we're hearing tomorrow. We will not be meeting next week. If you'll notice the agenda that came out, it's called the chair each day. And then we turn around and move the next meeting I think we will have will be, I think, on the 10th of March, our return day. I would imagine most of you have committee meetings all day tomorrow. For non-exempt committees, they will need to be kicking out the last of their bills. We'll be on the floor all next week. Anything else for the good of the committee? Yes, Rep. Camp.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a quick follow-up. First of all, thank you for the opportunity to speak with the lottery director earlier this week. I had made a comment about an estimate with the Oregon Lottery. I did get a follow-up call from the Oregon Lottery yesterday in regards to the numbers that I had estimated. So just want to confirm that, yeah, the numbers were correct. They had a total hold or revenue to the lottery of about $3.6 million in January. About $1 million of that went out to the contractor, so they did receive a net positive profit, if you will, to the lottery of about $2.6 million, which is about a 72% tax, if you will. I thought that was important to note, especially.
Would you send that to Connie?
Yes, sir.
That way Connie can get it out to the entire committee?
Absolutely.
Okay. There's one other thing. If you recall yesterday, I asked if there had been any surveys or studies done on veterans' health and medical marijuana study. I received a couple hours later a study out of the state of Massachusetts about veterans and medical marijuana. I found it very interesting. Connie, we sent that out. It's on, you should have it as part of your testimony. But I just like that I was able to ask for it. Didn't know it existed, and somebody supplied it to me. yesterday afternoon, so I would encourage you to take a little time and read through it. Other than that, there's nothing else for the good of the committee. We are adjourned.